Welcome to Conversations About Construction. I'm Dave Trafford. This podcast is produced and presented by the Residential and Civil Construction Alliance of Ontario. Members of the Alliance build your homes. They build your transportation networks and the systems that deliver safe, clean drinking water to your kitchen sink. This series will focus on industry innovations and solutions that support sustainable economic development and Ontario's world-class standard of living. In this episode, Ontario's infrastructure priorities. Our guests are Andy Manahan. He's the Executive Director of the Residential and Civil Construction Alliance of Ontario. Stephen Wickens also joins us. He's a transit researcher and an accomplished journalist. He recently authored the report, Station to Station, Why Subway Building Costs Have Soared in the Toronto Region. It was a report commissioned by the RCCAO. So now we are faced with all of these what next questions, and they're going to abound as we make our way through this pandemic. By all accounts, it's going to be here with us for maybe the next year and a half, and the economic fallout and the economic effects of all of this. How do we do our business? It's all going to be felt for generations to come. So a lot of that is going to have to do with how we stand this economy back up again. Infrastructure is going to be the key for many governments. It's quick, relatively easy way to jumpstart the economy, only because, well, we're already in an infrastructure deficit in most regions across the country. So there are shovel-ready projects, as they like to say. And they employ a lot of people, and they employ them in a hurry. And of course, there are challenges as far as getting people back to construction sites and physical distancing and all the new safety regimes that we have to deal with. But infrastructure is probably going to be the backbone in many ways of the recovery of this economy. Joining us is Andy Manahan. He is the Executive Director of the Residential and Civil Construction Alliance of Ontario. And Stephen Wickens is a transit researcher. He is a journalist and has penned a report for the RCCAO on the costs of building public transit, particularly in Toronto. Now, I think that, as you know, you guys start to lay out some of the white papers and the reports that you've been producing over the last 6 months. You know, it almost sounds like you knew something was coming. I mean, you presented so many thoughtful ideas on how infrastructure is affecting our economy, given your report on the gas tax, given your report on housing and solving some of the hallway health issues. And now we've got this one on transit, and it puts a whole new light on all of this for us as far as infrastructure was concerned and how we were going to manage it in the COVID era.
Well, I guess first I want to thank you for allowing me onto your show. But secondly, I want to assure you that we had no idea that this COVID-19 pandemic was coming. RCCO does engage a lot of researchers to look at issues for us. Sometimes trends that were talked about a few years ago, like autonomous vehicles, may take off. One example I'll give you right now is, e-commerce was already trending pretty strongly, but because of COVID, we're seeing a lot more deliveries to people's homes and businesses, and that is diminishing kind of a bricks and mortar environment for the commercial sector. I think certainly the pandemic has intensified those types of trends. I guess the question is, are some of these trends going to be permanent, or are they more temporary in nature? And as we get into the discussion with respect to the impacts on transit and transportation in general, these are really important questions.
Stephen, you know that when you were working on this and kind of trying to lay it all out, you were talking about the cost of building subway lines. But again, that was in the pre-COVID business model. It's completely changed in a matter of weeks.
Yeah, it has. And I think, the vulnerabilities that we're facing right now were a long time in coming. And we haven't built subways well, or maybe even intelligently, for about 40 years. And well, I went into this project suspecting certain things. It's confirmed. The research ended up confirming things in a much stronger way than I expected. And so, the report was written in a pre-COVID era, but I think it's going to be doubly important now, in that we're probably going to have a lot more competition for infrastructure funding. And I think that the public's probably going to be a lot less forgiving for spending infrastructure money unwisely or loosely. You know, I think the public's going to trust experts more than they have before. Certainly, we're seeing that more with healthcare now, and I think we're going to see it more now on things like transit.
Well, it sort of begs the question, though. I mean, if we can keep walking down this path, is public transit, I mean, mass transit subways, is that a good investment of public dollars right now, given the nature of the model and given the size of the system that we would need to accommodate? And then there's the transit customer in this day and age.
Cities have to rely on public transit in the end anyway. There's just, there's no way that you can have mass car reliance without the type of congestion that just chokes off mobility and growth, et cetera. So I think that we're going to get back to the type of city where we again have to build subways, but we're going to have to start learning the lessons from the time in Toronto when we were really good at subway building. The world used to come to Toronto to see how it was done, and we kind of seem to have forgotten how to do that because we went through this long period where the TTC was the group that had accumulated such remarkable expertise was sort of kind of cut out of the game.
If I can jump in on that, Dave, I was going to say that not only the TTC, but GO Transit and a lot of public transit systems across the Greater Toronto Area, and for that matter, across the world, have seen a phenomenal drop in ridership. I think TTC was 85% drop, and GO Transit, that would include trains and buses, has dropped by about 90%. As we ease out of this pandemic, we're still going to have to practice physical distancing on transit systems. And that means even if we get out of this, there will still be a lower level of ridership, I would think, than what we had in the past. Difficult to forecast these types of things, but certainly some of the trends we're seeing right now, and we're fitting into this perfectly by this conversation right now, is that we're doing this remotely. And there will be a lot more of telework for those that can do it, so people working from home. So will that dampen the demand for ridership? Yes, to a certain degree, but I completely agree with Stephen that in large urbanized areas, we need the heavy workhorse of heavy rail to move a lot of people around our systems.
Yeah, the interesting thing to me, though, as we kind of grind this thing through, is that it very much depends, not to some degree, on how much we work at home, but there's also the tolerance for me as a transit user to say, I'm going to actually step into that subway car. I want to get on that bus. I mean, if I can find an alternative way, well, it reminds me to a lesser degree of how things are going to play out in the airline industry. And so governments can step in and spend as much money as they want trying to bail out these large airline companies. But if you and I aren't going to put a bum in the seat, well, that's a problem. Then it really doesn't matter how much money you pour into the industry to some degree. You know, again, that mass transit, there's going to be a lag time, Andy, and maybe for years.
Yeah. So I think what we're talking about is the real risk. So, if we do discover a vaccine or, we're somehow immunized to COVID, we reduce the real risk, but the public will still have a perception of that risk. So some people may end up driving their car even more, even though we get back to kind of our pre-COVID congestion levels on the streets. But still, I think, to use the metaphor, we have to keep our pedal to the metal and build transit. We had a terrible example recently where out of the Attorney General's office, the Halton Courthouse was canceled. And this was something that was, a 3-year process in terms of general contractors. There were, fine-tuning their bids and almost ready to go. It was going to be built in Milton, and it was a very old facility. So, members in my network are saying, if the province can do it for this type of project, will they be wavering in their support for transit as well? And that's something that, as an infrastructure advocate, we want to ensure that the merits of transit continue to be recognized by governments of all stripes.
Yeah. And if I could jump in here, I think that, one of the things we have to do with transit in the post-COVID world is create an awful lot of excess capacity, which traditionally has been seen as an inefficiency in transit. But in the Toronto case, I mean, we may complain about the PTC or Go Transit or whatever, but in North American terms, they are remarkably efficient systems. And in the post-COVID world, it's the most efficient systems, the ones that are most reliant on the fare bucks, that are going to feel the pain the most. So it's sort of generally you want to reward efficiency. In this instance, COVID is going to punish it. And a lot of the problem that we have is that, we didn't have any spare capacity before COVID, and now we need far more spare capacity than we would normally have ever needed. So it's a mess.
Yeah. It'll be interesting to see not just how the transit authorities in Ontario respond to this situation, but, there's going to be a problem for transit authorities around the world. I can't imagine what's going to go on in New York, for example.
Yeah. I mean, New York is in a terrible situation. They used to run a 24/7 subway system, and now, because they have to clean the trains, they've stopped running between about 1 and 5 a.m. in the morning. So that's a big change after decades of running schedules in a certain way in that city. Europe, also some terrible situations. But what we've seen is kind of the rise of bicycling in both North American and European cities. For people who may not be quite as agile, perhaps e-bikes is a solution. For the younger generation, we had already seen a trend of e-scooters. So those sorts of things may intensify a little bit more. But again, I think governments have to be agile because, as Steve was alluding to, there are some severe constraints on revenue because, payroll taxes are down, sales taxes are down, gas taxes are down because, other than trucking and moving goods, people aren't on the roads to the same extent that they were previously. So some real formidable challenges for us right now.
And further to your point, Andy, the rise of more demand for things like cycling is going to create lots of competition for road space. You know how touchy that can be as a political issue. There's some fairly good research out there that would indicate that bicycles actually do use road space more efficiently than cars, but people get their backs up. Sometimes about just the addition of a bike lane on the street, and I think Toronto's probably going to have to maybe take the opportunity of the warm weather that's coming up in the next few months to experiment with some real bike priorities on roads like Yonge Street and on Bloor and Danforth to sort of bleed off some of that pressure that the subway system is going to find itself under when we reopen the economy.
So the transportation infrastructure is going to be shaky at best as we move through this. Then if we're looking at it, I mean, priorities up until now, January, February, transit had been a priority. Now, what would you see rewritten in that list of priorities for infrastructure to get us back and standing up again?
Yeah, that's a tough question to answer right now, but certainly any leading transportation specialists that we talk to within our network have said that the Ontario line is necessary, certainly, as Steve said, to enhance capacity. It may be viewed as a little bit of a redundancy in terms of our network, but let's say the Yonge line breaks down, we're going to need that relief valve, so to speak, to ensure that people get to and from downtown and to the suburbs. Other communities such as Hamilton that just came out with a task force may have other solutions in terms of whether they build an LRT or some other form of higher order transit. And that is there a role, for example, for pension funds to step into the game? So I know this, I'm kind of moving on to the next issue in terms of funding, but with government revenues being so constrained, we do have to be creative. And if we do see a real demand for a transit infrastructure project, hopefully there's players out there that can help us get to where we need to get to.
It sounds to me like you're suggesting, this will light a fire under the P3 model again. All right. Because what we have seen here through the narrative, through all of this, almost at every stage of this pandemic so far, has been the need for all of us to work together on that. And so we're going to have to break or innovate around the models. Stephen, in terms of how we have public sector and private sector and nonprofit sectors all working towards the same thing, because we can't sort of delineate it anymore. We're really going to all have to take responsibility on how we accomplish these things and get them moving forward.
P3 is another one of those terms that gets people's backs up. But really, if you look at things historically, going right back to the 1860s when the first subway was built in London, every major transit infrastructure project has been a public-private partnership to some degree or in some form. They've evolved over the decades, or I guess nearly or a century and a half, as funding needs and funding availability has either dried up or what have you. So, and so I think, people who say that, we've got to ditch the whole P3 model are kind of missing the point that we probably do have to adjust it to get it right. But P3s are with us no matter what.
Yeah, and I think for the sake of this conversation and clarity, the public-private partnership is really about sharing risk.
Absolutely.
Now, Andy, is there something outside of transportation that when we begin to look at infrastructure that's going to be on the horizon, is there something else that bubbles to the surface as far as infrastructure is concerned that we should be expecting to sort of take up some of this load?
Essentially, Toronto region has been built in the North American model. We do have a high functioning and very dense downtown core. Now we have subnodes in various centers across the region. But we really are reliant on vehicles to get us around. So we still have to continue investing in road and highway infrastructure. I think that's a given for this region. That may be a different set of circumstances if you're talking about European cities, which are highly train-based. So that would be, for me, a big sort of talking point here is that we need both kind of typical road infrastructure as well as transit infrastructure, and we have to think about a multimodal approach. So, in downtown Toronto, where you can add more bike lanes, I think that's quite viable. That may not be so viable if someone is skirting across the 905 and has a 40-kilometer commute or something of that nature.
I would say that one of the things we've really got to be thinking about more is trying to reduce the amount of travel that people do. It's certainly not a short-term thing, but it's a long-term goal that we've got to get to. And part of it as well will involve trying to find ways of making transit more relevant, competitive, and viable in the suburbs. And I don't think we can do that simply by adding infrastructure, operations, smarter approaches to the fare models, et cetera, are going to be an essential part of that. One of the things that COVID has done is it's sort of upended the priority list. And this is a strictly transit bit, and I know that you were talking to Andy about other forms of infrastructure, but I think that on the transit front, we were talking about capital and infrastructure projects, but I think we've now got to find an operations model that works again in the post-COVID world. That's our short-term thing. And then longer term, when we look at the infrastructure, we've just got to get a lot smarter about how we build it. And we're probably going to be forced to be much more selective about which projects we take on.
All right. And again, not without opening a whole new can of worms here, though. But I put it to both of you. This is going to require a show of political courage at all levels of government. Andy, and I know that, you kind of find a difficult thing to navigate on a good day, trying to manage governments and expectations. But we're really going to need a level of leadership if we're going to be able to pull this together and get the job done.
Absolutely. We were talking before we came live on air with respect to the federal government, and they were a little bit slow in terms of the phase one infrastructure program during the first term, the 2017 period. Right now, I think there's a reliance on the federal government because the province is completely tapped. Municipal governments are facing cash crunches all over the place. So the support from the federal level, and whether that's, strict programs that they have right now, or, making better use of the Canada Infrastructure Bank to deploy projects that may be bundled or connected in some way. And this might be everything from broadband, which is a non-traditional form of infrastructure, to our more traditional things. But certainly the federal government, because Minister McKenna was formerly in the climate change portfolio, is now head of infrastructure and communities. I think she's trying to recalibrate the kinds of projects that are delivered. So she is thinking about COVID and the pandemic, and we don't want to do kind of status quo projects. We want to make sure that they're pretty good for the longer haul.
Yeah, and I think that term political courage means that we're going to have to rely on politicians who are willing to listen to people who are telling awkward truths to power. In terms of our transit infrastructure, we've had a problem for too long with politicians becoming involved in the early phases of the planning process, choosing projects that lock us in too early in the process, and then using our experts to provide decision-based evidence making, as opposed to really searching for the best ways of delivering these projects. And in the coming months, my biggest fear is that the governments are going to be in such a rush to shovel money out the door that we end up with boondoggles that further undermine the public's faith in the process and the leaders and even our experts.
Well, and they only get one crack at it, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there is not a lot of opportunity here. And we talk about this long generational effect, Andy, but that window of opportunity is a fairly narrow window and may not be open for long.
Yeah, well, for people like Steve who are transit historians, we saw what happened in the 80s and 90s where investment essentially dried up in terms of transit. And even though we're in a tight financial spot, somehow we have to make it work. And I think one of the advantages we have now compared to the 90s is that low interest rates are really going to help us in terms of borrowing for large capital projects. So that's a positive. You have to look at some positives. Half glass full. I'm that kind of a person.
Yeah, well, especially if they're going to pay you to take the money, right?
But we don't know how long interest rates will remain low, because if lenders start losing faith in government's ability to repay these loans, that's when the interest rates start to climb, and there can be a compound interest horror show that we don't want to deal with.
Well, this is and will continue to be an evolving situation. And the interesting thing for me is that at every turn on a given day or a week during this pandemic, we're learning more about the coronavirus and how it affects us physically. But here it is. Every week we're learning more about what we are going to do in terms of how we live, how we work, play, and at some level have recreation. And all of these things are so just tied together. But I still think that if we're going to get the economy back up and running, infrastructure is just going to have to be that backbone, making us upright, moving us forward. Again, Stephen, Andy, thanks for joining us. This was a great conversation. I suspect we'll require another one in the coming weeks, however. Talk to you then.
I hope so. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dave.
Thanks to Andy Manahan and Stephen Wickens for being our guest today. You've been listening to Conversations About Construction, and we'd encourage you to subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts and share it with your network. Conversations About Construction is produced for the Residential and Civil Construction Alliance of Ontario by Eye Contact Productions. I'm Dave Trafford.